Okay, welcome to our second of our quick write videos. And so this is the quick write assignment for Module 3, in which we're dealing with the Americas. And what I'd like to do in this quick write assignment is to ask you to explore your experience with diversity as a geographic phenomena. And so in doing this, when you read the quick write assignment, what I'm really asking you to do is examine how you experience different types of diversity in your community, and then how, from a broader geographic standpoint, this might play out in terms of factors in the United States and really more broadly across the Americas. It is very true that while, again, currently we're having significant problems in the United States, challenges in terms of protests and conflict in our urban areas, that a lot of these conflicts have not spread into rural areas. And so what we might want to ask is, what is the difference and how different are rural and urban areas in the United States and by extension throughout the Americas? And so I want to begin with the idea of first race and ethnicity. And one of the things that we can see, this is a very interesting map that was done a couple of years ago based on the 2010 census. And what it literally does is takes a dot for every person in the United States and at least the block that they live on. And within that map, then, what we can see is the race ethnicity of those people. And what we see at a kind of national scale, first of all, there's not a lot of people out west. I mean, we can certainly see how people are distributed across the United States. But the other thing that we begin to see is that it's very clear that much of the United States is Caucasian in terms of our rural areas. But that really is not the case as we begin to look more carefully at urban areas. So again, if we look at just Pennsylvania for the moment and into Ohio, where again I've learned most of you are from, what we would see then is that, if you will, the general color of the map is blue, which indicates predominantly Caucasian white populations. But if we begin to zoom in, what we notice very quickly is that our urban areas, for example, here's Pittsburgh, Youngstown, Cleveland, that the characteristics of their populations begin to be very, very different. And again, as we zoom in, what you'll notice also is that the dots kind of stop kind of coalescing together. And again, you'll see the very low population densities. And again, that is one of the characteristics of urban versus rural in the Americas. Populations in urban centers are very, very dense. Populations in rural areas are very, very sparse. But again, I want to zoom in, and I'm going to use a couple of examples of people that are in class. If we start with Pittsburgh, one of the first things we're going to notice about race and ethnicity is that, in fact, Pittsburgh is significantly different than its surrounding communities. And what I mean by that is twofold. First of all, from a race ethnicity standpoint, virtually all of the major racial groups that the census identifies are present in substantial numbers. And in fact, if we look again, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more on Pittsburgh. And what we see here is very clearly that Pittsburgh has large ethnic areas or racial areas that are fairly distinct. That's also to some degree problematic in that it is also indicative that we do not have as strong a diversity in blocks, but that the overall city is significantly diverse. Now, you will notice that this kind of central core area in Pittsburgh is in fact quite diverse. We have substantial populations of Asian Americans, and then we would also have, again, all of the white or Caucasian groups and significant African American populations, but that we see also this divide. Again, it is not evenly diverse across the landscape. We can also say that this is true. We have a couple people that live near Newcastle, and I want to look at Newcastle because it is kind of another interesting kind of microcosm of an area that I wouldn't quite call heavily urban, but you'll notice that again, as we go in closer to Newcastle, we begin to see that Newcastle as an area has substantially more diverse landscape than the areas surrounding it. And so that is a characteristic of American landscapes, that racial and ethnic diversity is very homogeneous. In other words, essentially very low diversity in our rural areas, and as we move towards urban areas, it becomes more diverse. Now, that is not just the case in terms of race and ethnicity, but we can see this, and I'm going to talk about this in terms of income extremes. And I want to go back. I'm going to put in, this is a slightly different map, but we're going to look at two aspects here as well. And so if I look again at Pittsburgh, what I'm going to currently show you is the color of the dots here. I'm going to again, I'm going to change this map up just a little bit here. It'll make it a little easier to see what's going on. The color of the dot here indicates the predominant income level for this area. So let me open this up. And again, so we're looking at income. And what we have here is that if you see a dot that is yellow, that means that that is an income of greater than 200,000. And if, I'm sorry, if I said that backwards, I apologize. A dot that is blue indicates an income of greater than 200,000. A dot that is yellow indicates an income of less than 25,000. So in other words, if we think about that, that is a very wealthy portion versus a very poor portion. And what we see again in Pittsburgh is that we have fairly mixed incomes to very high incomes in the central area, and then our incomes fall off very quickly into very low income concentrations. Now, again, extremes of income. As we move out from Pittsburgh, and again, I'm going to move us back up here to, for example, here's Elwood City, and then we'll move up into Newcastle. What we see again is that within these areas that are more urban, we tend to see this rather pronounced distinction between very rich and very poor. Whereas as we move out into the rural areas, the variability of income is substantially lower. Okay, so in other words, more homogeneous, more the same in terms of our income. Now, the other way that we can look at this, I'm going to turn off the income component, and now I'm going to turn on education. And now these dots are not individual people, but these are what we would call census tracts. So remember last time I talked about enumeration units. So each one of these dots indicates the dominant educational attainment within a census tract. And what is interesting, again, what we see in the United States, again, red dots mean the dominant educational level is high school. Purple means some college. Blue means bachelor's degrees. And if you get into teal, that's graduate degrees. And what we see in most of the United States, and I'm going to kind of zoom way out, is that it's very clear that the rural areas are consistently dominated by populations that have high school diplomas as the average educational attainment. And so again, if we'll just, I'm going to pick somewhere out here in the middle of the state here. And what this says, so we're out in Clarion County, that by far the majority of the population has a high school degree, but nothing higher than that. That doesn't mean that there aren't some of the population that have higher educations, but most of the people have the same level of education. In contrast, when we look again at Pittsburgh, what we begin to see is that, again, across the landscape of Pittsburgh, we see this idea of diversity of education, but not mixed. And so again, what I want to point out here, we're going to go up here kind of north in Allegheny County, and what you'll see up here to the north is that the dominant educational group has a bachelor's degree. And in fact, a significant population has something above that. But what we also see is that there is a significant population that has a high school education. But again, more of the bachelor's degree or higher. But then when we go down into the city, we begin to see these ideas of, again, this is an area where high school education, but right adjacent to it is post-baccalaureate or graduate level. So cities have very different ranges of things, whereas smaller towns and rural areas are very, very similar to each other. And in the United States, there are implications to that. And in fact, I think what we're seeing today are some of the implications of that. So this is simply an introduction to what we can see. And again, I'm going to zoom this out as we wrap this up. But if we look at the United States across these things, what we see is that, again, urban versus rural is different. The way that our cultural landscapes exist presents challenges because of these areas that are very diverse or have very broad ranges versus areas that are very similar. So again, this is education. I'm going to turn this one back off, and now I'm going to turn on income extremes. And again, what you'll notice is that it's fairly consistent. Moderately lower incomes kind of scattered throughout the rural areas, and then in our urban areas we see significantly higher concentrations of high wealth, but also of very low income. All right, so use that information to answer your quick write assignment, and we'll see you in Module 4.